Something doesn't add up here. A league finally gets the kind of moment it spent decades chasing, and instead of popping champagne, there's tension behind closed doors. Not the public kind you see on social media, but the uncomfortable kind that people whisper about when cameras are off. A glossy commercial drops, one that should have been an automatic win for everyone involved, and suddenly the mood shifts. No celebration, no unified messaging, just an eerie sense that not everyone is happy about success finally showing up at the door. Here's the part that makes people uneasy. The WNBA has spent years asking for attention, fighting for relevance, and explaining why the world should care. Then, almost overnight, one player changes the conversation. Ratings spike, arenas sell out, sponsors line up. You'd expect leadership to lean all the way in. Instead, reports and commentary suggest the reaction wasn't excitement, but irritation. And when a league appears frustrated by its own momentum, it raises a dangerous question. Who exactly is this success supposed to benefit? At the center of that tension is Caitlin Clark, a player whose impact goes far beyond box scores. The commercial itself wasn't outrageous, it wasn't controversial. It was what any major sports league dreams of: polished, confident, and unmistakably star-driven. The kind of content that tells casual fans, this matters, you should be watching. Yet, instead of feeling like a victory lap, it became a flashpoint. And when insiders and prominent voices start hinting that league executives weren't thrilled, people can't help but wonder why. That's where the unease really sets in. Because this isn't about one ad or even one athlete. It's about what happens when an institution built on control suddenly realizes it doesn't own the spotlight anymore. When attention flows naturally toward an individual instead of being carefully distributed from the top down. When a league that's used to managing narratives is forced to react instead of lead. Those moments expose fault lines you didn't even know were there. And the most unsettling part is this: the commercial didn't create these cracks, it revealed them. Whatever frustration exists now was already simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a moment like this to bring it into focus. Because when success arrives and not everyone is smiling, it's a sign that the problem isn't visibility, it's power. And once power starts shifting, everything else starts to feel a lot more fragile. At face value, the commercial itself is almost boring in how normal it is. High production quality, confident pacing, sharp visuals, and one clear message. This player isn't just part of the league, she's a reason to tune in. In most professional sports, that kind of advertisement would be treated like free gold. Leagues usually rush to repost it, celebrate it, and wrap their brand around the momentum. This is what they're supposed to want. This is the point of building a sport into the mainstream. But this time, the temperature didn't rise in a good way. According to reports and commentary circulating among media personalities, the reaction inside league offices wasn't excitement, it wasn't strategic planning, it was frustration. Some have claimed it was outright anger, not disappointment over execution or concern about messaging, but irritation at what the commercial represented. And that distinction matters because being upset about symbolism is very different from being upset about performance. The symbolism was clear the moment the ad aired. Caitlin Clark wasn't presented as just another face in a team jersey. She was positioned as the attraction, the center of gravity. Someone capable of pulling attention without the league acting as a middleman. For fans, that's exciting. For sponsors, it's efficient. But for an organization accustomed to controlling how stars are framed, it can feel like losing the steering wheel while the car is still moving. Commentators discussing the situation have been careful to frame this as reported sentiment rather than confirmed statements. No official press release came out condemning the ad. No executive went on record saying they were unhappy. Instead, what people noticed was the silence, the absence of amplification, the lack of public enthusiasm you'd expect when one of your players lands a major cultural moment. That silence became the story, because in sports business, what leadership doesn't endorse can be just as revealing as what it celebrates. What really changed the temperature wasn't the commercial itself, but the realization that it didn't need the league to work. It aired, it spread, and it resonated without institutional help. Analysts have suggested that this may have highlighted an uncomfortable truth. The league was no longer the gatekeeper of its biggest moment. When attention flows independently of the organization, it forces executives to confront a loss of influence they may not be ready to acknowledge. And that's why this moment landed differently. The commercial wasn't controversial, but it was disruptive. It quietly redrew the power lines. It suggested that the engine driving interest in women's basketball might not be the system, the slogans, or the long-term strategy, but one individual who connects instantly with fans. And once that idea takes hold, it's impossible to unsee. Because if one commercial can do all of that on its own, it raises a much bigger question about who's really in control of the narrative now. For years, the WNBA has operated on a very specific philosophy, one that's been repeated so often it's become part of the league's identity. The message has always been clear: this is bigger than any one player. The focus should be on the collective, the history, the sisterhood, the idea that the league itself is the star. Individual greatness mattered, but it was always supposed to fit neatly inside a larger, carefully balanced system. That approach wasn't accidental. It was a conscious strategy built over decades. The logic behind it made sense on paper. When a league is still fighting for visibility, leaning too hard on a single face can feel risky. What if that player leaves, gets injured, or fades from the spotlight? By selling the collective, the league protected itself from being dependent on one person. Everyone was meant to rise together, and no one was supposed to tower too far above the rest. The problem is that sports don't actually work that way, especially in the modern media landscape. Fans don't fall in love with logos or mission statements. They connect with personalities, moments, and players who feel different. They choose stars organically, whether institutions approve or not. And that's where friction started to build. The league kept pushing a system-focused narrative while audiences were gravitating toward individual brilliance. That gap between what leadership wanted and what fans responded to kept widening, quietly at first, then all at once. When Caitlin Clark entered the picture, that philosophy was suddenly put under a microscope. Her appeal didn't require explanation or adjustment. People tuned in because they wanted to see her play, not because they were told to care about the broader mission. That kind of attention doesn't spread evenly, and it doesn't wait its turn. It goes where excitement is strongest, even if that disrupts the planned hierarchy. From the outside, the league's collective-first messaging began to feel less like unity and more like restraint. Instead of amplifying what was clearly resonating, leadership appeared cautious, almost hesitant, to let one player become too synonymous with the product. Commentators have suggested that this hesitation stems from fear of undermining everything that came before. If one athlete breaks through this dramatically, it quietly challenges the idea that stardom must be cultivated slowly and evenly. That's why the commercial hit such a nerve. It didn't just elevate a player, it bypassed the philosophy entirely. It told a story the league didn't author, and it did so at scale. In a system built on balance and shared spotlight, that kind of singular focus feels like rebellion, even if it's driven by demand rather than intent. And once that tension is exposed, it becomes harder and harder to pretend that the old approach still fits the reality everyone is now watching unfold. What really intensified the situation wasn't just that the commercial existed, but who made it and how effortlessly it landed. Major sponsors stepped in and did in seconds what the league itself had struggled to do for years: clean storytelling, modern pacing, a clear sense of scale. The ad didn't feel like an experiment or a favor. It felt confident, polished, and intentional, the kind of branding usually reserved for athletes who already sit at the top of their sport. That contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, you had outside companies treating women's basketball like a premier product, worthy of cinematic visuals and prime-time placement. On the other, the league's own marketing often felt safer, slower, and stuck in an older era of sports promotion. Analysts didn't need to spell it out for viewers to see the gap. The sponsors weren't just promoting a player, they were demonstrating what the sport could look like when it was sold without hesitation. This is where the discomfort reportedly started to deepen. When brands independently create moments that elevate the entire sport, they also shine a light on what hasn't been done internally. Commentators have suggested that every high-profile campaign now functions as an unintentional comparison, not between players, but between capabilities.
If sponsors can generate excitement, cultural relevance, and viral momentum with precision, it raises an unavoidable question about why the league itself hasn't consistently delivered the same energy. The issue isn't that the league doesn't benefit from these partnerships. It absolutely does. Visibility rises, interest grows, new fans show up. The issue, according to analysts discussing the situation, is control. These campaigns don't pass through the league's messaging filter. They don't reinforce a carefully balanced narrative. They position Caitlin Clark as a singular force, not a shared symbol. And once that framing takes hold, it's hard for leadership to walk it back. What makes this especially complicated is how natural it all feels to the audience. Fans aren't questioning why these ads exist or whether they're good for the sport. They just enjoy them, they share them, they respond to them emotionally. That organic reaction is something you can't manufacture or regulate, and that loss of control can be unsettling for an organization used to guiding the narrative from the top down.
In a way, the sponsors didn't just promote a player, they exposed a ceiling the league didn't even realize it was operating under. They showed how big the moment could feel when fear and restraint were removed from the equation. And once viewers saw that version of women's basketball, it became harder to accept anything less. That shift in expectation is subtle, but it's powerful. Because when the audience starts looking to outside brands for excitement instead of the league itself, the balance of influence quietly starts to change. One of the most uncomfortable ideas to surface in recent commentary is the suggestion that culture doesn't stop at the boardroom door. In professional sports, leadership tone has a way of seeping into everything, even when nothing is said publicly. Analysts have pointed out that players, coaches, and officials are incredibly sensitive to what gets emphasized, what gets protected, and what quietly gets brushed aside. When the top of an organization appears uneasy about a certain player's spotlight, that unease doesn't stay isolated for long. This is where the concept of permission structures comes into the conversation. It's not about direct orders or explicit instructions. It's about signals. Who gets defended quickly? Who gets promoted loudly? Who receives silence when controversy hits? Commentators discussing this situation have stressed that in elite sports environments, those signals shape behavior. When protection feels inconsistent, it can create the impression that certain boundaries are softer than they should be. Observers began to connect dots once the season got physical. Hard fouls, lingering contact, moments that felt just aggressive enough to raise eyebrows without triggering immediate consequences. No one is claiming these actions were coordinated or intentional. That distinction matters, but fans and analysts alike started asking why reactions from the league office felt slower, quieter, or more measured than expected when the most visible player was involved. According to prominent voices in sports media, including Stephen A. Smith, leadership attitude often sets the emotional temperature for the entire ecosystem. If executives appear resentful rather than protective, it subtly reshapes how players interpret what's acceptable. Not because they're told to behave differently, but because the invisible shield that usually surrounds a league's most valuable asset doesn't feel as strong. What makes this especially troubling is how plausible it feels. Leagues don't operate in a vacuum. Everyone is watching how decisions are made and how quickly support shows up. When enforcement feels delayed or uneven, perception becomes reality. And once players sense that a superstar isn't being actively protected by the institution, competitive intensity can cross into something more personal, even if no one intends it to. This alleged trickle-down effect is why the conversation has moved far beyond one commercial or one ad campaign. It's about the ecosystem leadership creates, intentionally or not. If frustration exists at the top, it can manifest as ambiguity below. And ambiguity is dangerous in a sport built on physicality, rivalry, and emotion, because when lines aren't clearly enforced from above, people will test how far they can push them. What made the situation impossible to ignore wasn't backlash or public criticism from the league. It was the absence of anything at all. No reposts, no celebratory captions, no visible acknowledgement that one of their players had just landed a major mainstream moment.
In an era where leagues treat social amplification like oxygen, that kind of quiet stands out immediately. Fans noticed it before analysts ever weighed in, because silence in modern sports media almost always carries meaning. In most professional leagues, star-driven moments are treated as shared victories. When a player lands a massive deal or drops a high-profile campaign, the league wraps its arms around it. It understands that attention for one becomes attention for all. That's how the NBA operates, and it's why their biggest stars feel publicly supported, even when controversies arise. Promotion isn't optional there, it's reflexive, it's part of the ecosystem. The contrast felt sharp once fans compared that approach to what they were seeing here. Caitlin Clark was everywhere on television, yet barely visible on official league channels during that same window. Commentators discussing the situation were careful not to label this as sabotage or intent. Instead, they pointed to pattern recognition. When something significant happens and the institution responsible for celebrating it doesn't respond, people naturally start filling in the blanks. Silence also has a compounding effect. It invites speculation. It reinforces narratives of discomfort and resentment, even if leadership never says a word. Fans don't expect perfection, but they do expect consistency. When other players receive quick amplification and marquee moments are met with hesitation, it feels selective. And in sports culture, perceived selectivity quickly turns into perceived bias. What's striking is how unnecessary this all feels. Amplifying success costs nothing. A repost doesn't erase the collective, and a congratulatory message doesn't diminish anyone else. Yet the lack of response made the commercial feel almost unofficial, as if it existed outside the league's blessing. That perception matters because fans aren't just consuming content, they're interpreting how institutions behave around that content. In the end, the silence did more narrative damage than any statement ever could. It quietly confirmed what many were already wondering, not because anyone admitted it, but because choosing not to speak often reveals more than speaking ever could. Once the conversation shifted, it was only a matter of time before it landed on money. Not contracts or cap numbers in the traditional sense, but something far more uncomfortable for leadership. Every major commercial, every premium brand partnership quietly reminds the public that there's a massive disconnect between how much value certain players generate and how little the league itself is able to compensate them. And nothing exposes a broken business model faster than success you didn't directly create or control.
When viewers see Caitlin Clark fronting national campaigns, they don't just see a star, they see leverage. They see someone pulling in revenue streams that dwarf her league paycheck, and that naturally leads to questions casual fans never used to ask. Why, if this player is driving sold-out arenas, higher ratings, and cultural buzz, does the league still struggle financially? Why does the economic upside feel so disconnected from the spectacle everyone is witnessing? Commentators have suggested that this is where discomfort turns into defensiveness. Every high-end ad becomes an accidental audit of the league's economics. It invites comparisons leadership would rather avoid. Comparisons between endorsement money and salaries, between brand-driven momentum and institutional stagnation. Instead of conversations about growth, the spotlight shifts to why revenue sharing hasn't caught up and why the league still leans so heavily on external support to stay afloat. From that perspective, the tension makes a certain kind of sense. It's not that endorsements hurt the league, they expose its limitations. They put pressure on executives to explain why a player can independently generate enormous value while the system around her still operates in scarcity mode. Analysts discussing the situation have framed this as a fear response, not fear of the player, but fear of the questions she forces into the open. Rather than capitalizing on that visibility to reset the financial narrative, leadership appears, at least publicly, hesitant. And hesitation in moments like this doesn't read as caution, it reads as resistance. The irony is that success should make these conversations easier, not harder. But when a league hasn't fully solved its revenue pipeline, a breakout star doesn't just lift the tide, she exposes the cracks in the hull.
That's why the financial angle looms over everything else. Behind the discussion of tone, promotion, and culture sits a simple reality. The more visible the star becomes, the harder it is to pretend the economics don't need to change. And for an institution that spent years defending its structure, that pressure can feel less like opportunity and more like threat. When tension like this builds, it inevitably starts to concentrate around one figure, not because that person controls every detail, but because they symbolize the direction of the organization. In this case, that spotlight falls on Kathy Engelbert, a commissioner brought in specifically to modernize the league and steer it through a new phase of growth. Her background wasn't rooted in basketball culture as much as corporate leadership, and that context matters when evaluating how this moment is being perceived. Engelbert was hired to bring stability, structure, and business discipline to a league that had long operated as a cause-driven enterprise. The expectation was clear: scale the product, improve revenue, and make the WNBA financially sustainable. But the rise of Caitlin Clark has accelerated everything at a pace no strategic plan could have predicted. And when growth outpaces governance, leadership ends up reacting instead of directing. Commentators analyzing the situation have been careful not to frame this as personal animosity. Instead, they describe something more structural. Clark's star power has exposed how limited the league's existing tools really are. The commissioner suddenly finds herself being measured not against past leadership, but against outside brands, viral reach, and global attention she doesn't fully control. That's an incredibly uncomfortable position for any executive whose job depends on appearing ahead of the curve. Public moments haven't helped ease that pressure. When Engelbert has been asked about the intensity surrounding Clark, particularly in televised interviews, her answers have often landed awkwardly. Attempts to sound diplomatic or measured have sometimes been interpreted as detached or evasive. Analysts have suggested that these responses don't calm the narrative, they fuel it. Because when leadership appears unsure during a breakout moment, audiences start wondering if the wrong person is steering the ship. There's also the unavoidable reality of accountability. Owners, sponsors, and partners don't just see the hype, they see the numbers. Ticket sales jump, ratings spike, travel policies change. If all of that growth is being driven by one player, questions naturally follow. What happens if that momentum isn't maximized? Who is responsible if the league fails to convert visibility into long-term infrastructure? Those questions land squarely on the commissioner's desk. That's why Engelbert ends up at the center of this storm, whether she wants to or not. She represents the league's ability to adapt, and right now, adaptation feels slower than the moment demands. The commercial didn't just elevate a player, it intensified scrutiny on leadership. And once that scrutiny begins, every decision, every pause, and every moment of silence gets examined through a much harsher lens. What makes this moment so destabilizing is that it isn't just about popularity or publicity, it's about leverage, and leverage is the one thing professional sports leagues are used to controlling. For decades, the formula was simple. Players needed the league for exposure, legitimacy, and income. The organization held the cards, and stars, no matter how big, still operated within that framework. What's happening now doesn't fit that model, and that's why it feels so uncomfortable to acknowledge. From the moment Caitlin Clark entered the professional ranks, it was clear she arrived with something most rookies don't. She didn't need to introduce herself to the public. The audience was already there. Millions of fans followed her from college, and brands recognized that instantly. That meant the league wasn't creating her platform. At best, it was inheriting it. And inheriting power is very different from building it yourself.
Analysts discussing this shift have pointed out how rare this dynamic really is. Instead of climbing the traditional ladder, Clark essentially stepped onto a different economic plane. Her visibility exists beyond league broadcasts. Her market extends past official channels. Endorsements, media appearances, and cultural relevance continue whether the league amplifies them or not. That fundamentally changes the balance of influence, because now the institution needs the player just as much, if not more, than the player needs the institution.
This is where alternative options quietly enter the conversation, not as threats but as realities. Competing leagues, off-season ventures, overseas opportunities, even independent branding paths all exist in a way they never did before. Commentators have noted that when a player reaches this level of independence, staying loyal becomes a choice rather than an obligation, and choice shifts power faster than confrontation ever could. What unsettles traditional sports structures is how calm this shift feels. There's no rebellion, no public demands, no ultimatums, just a slow recalibration of who holds influence. The commercial symbolized that perfectly. It didn't ask permission, it didn't wait for approval. It simply existed, performed, and moved culture forward on its own. That kind of autonomy doesn't announce itself loudly, but it's impossible to ignore once you see it. This is the power shift nobody wants to say out loud, not because it's hostile, but because it forces reckoning. If players can build economies bigger than the systems they're part of, the old rules stop applying. And when those rules stop working, institutions either evolve or cling tighter to control. The tension we're seeing now is what happens in that in-between space, when everyone realizes the balance has changed, but no one is quite ready to admit it. One reason this situation refuses to fade is because it's no longer being filtered through the same soft lens the WNBA has often benefited from in the past. For years, coverage around the league leaned heavily toward protection. Criticism was cautious, analysis was gentle. Everyone understood the mission, and many voices in sports media treated the league like a movement that needed support, rather than an enterprise that needed scrutiny. That era is ending, whether leadership is ready for it or not. A new wave of media figures has made that shift impossible to ignore. Analysts like Stephen A. Smith aren't approaching the WNBA as a charity case or a cultural obligation. They're evaluating it the same way they evaluate the biggest leagues in the world. Decisions get questioned, leadership gets critiqued, outcomes matter more than intentions, and when something doesn't make business sense, they say it out loud. This change in tone is jarring for an organization accustomed to controlled narratives. New media doesn't wait for press releases or official explanations. It reacts in real time, connects patterns publicly, and amplifies fan frustration instead of smoothing it over. When commentators openly discuss discomfort in league offices or question why a star isn't being fully embraced, it forces the conversation into the mainstream. What used to stay inside league circles now plays out in front of millions. The standards have changed along with the money. Visibility brings accountability. Ratings, ticket sales, and sponsorships create expectations that can't be managed with platitudes or vague assurances. Analysts are no longer asking whether the league deserves support. They're asking whether it's operating competently in a moment of opportunity. That's a very different kind of pressure, and it hits harder because it's public. What's especially uncomfortable is that this scrutiny isn't framed as hostility toward women's basketball. It's framed as belief. Belief that the league is big enough now to be evaluated seriously. And serious evaluation doesn't come with kid gloves. It comes with comparison to other leagues, to other commissioners, to other stars. That's the price of legitimacy, and it's one that can't be undone once it starts. This is why the reaction to one commercial spiraled into a broader debate about leadership and culture. New media didn't create the tension, it exposed it. By applying the same standards used everywhere else, it highlighted how out of sync the league's response appeared. And once those standards are applied, there's no going back to insulation. The spotlight stays on, and the expectation becomes simple and unforgiving. Either adapt to the moment or get left behind by it. All of this leads to a moment that feels unavoidable now. The WNBA is standing at a crossroads, and the path it chooses will define the next decade of the league, not just the next season. On one side is growth through alignment, embracing momentum instead of resisting it, letting success breathe even when it arrives faster and louder than planned. recognizing that a breakout star doesn't erase the past, but validates it. That path requires humility, adaptability, and a willingness to let the spotlight shine where the audience is already looking.
The other path is harder to defend, but easier for institutions to fall into. It's the path of control, of quiet resistance, of minimizing what can't be managed in the hope that balance eventually restores itself. History shows where that road leads: lost opportunities, fractured trust, and stars who eventually decide their energy is better spent elsewhere. Once resentment replaces celebration, it becomes almost impossible to fake unity, and fans are too perceptive to buy it. What makes this moment so consequential is that the league has been handed what most organizations wait generations for: a player who doesn't just perform, but moves culture. Someone who pulls in casual viewers and turns them into invested fans. Someone whose presence raises the ceiling for everyone involved. That kind of opportunity doesn't need to be manufactured, it needs to be protected and amplified. The uncomfortable truth is that this moment won't pause while leadership figures things out. Momentum doesn't wait for internal consensus. It either compounds or it fades. And the decisions being made right now, the silences, the hesitations, the reactions behind the scenes, will shape how this era is remembered. Not because of one commercial, but because of what it revealed. In the end, this isn't just a story about branding, power, or ego. It's a test of whether the league can evolve fast enough to match the moment it's been given. One path leads to becoming the major league it's always wanted to be. The other leads to watching that moment slip away, not in dramatic collapse, but in slow, avoidable erosion. There's still time to choose, but the window is narrower than it looks.